right, so thanks for inviting us to come into your space. My name is Lou Holmes. I'm one of the product managers at Progressive Insurance. And I'll go around the room really quickly and just kind of introduce first name only our team, just because they're the more impressive part of the crew. So we got Azaday, Amy, Carrie, Heather, Jennifer. In the back we've got Christy, Lonnie, Mary Lynn, and another Amy. Look at why. So before we get started, I guess three things I'd like to mention. First of all, I thought the last group did a great job, so commend them on the work they put in. Second, I'd like to reiterate they did have a marketing leader on their team. Not that we want to make that a big deal, but you know, it is what it is. And third, I believe Jeff and I had an agreement on wardrobe, and he decided to one-up me with the jacket, so you know, we'll talk about that after the fact. So real quick, I'm just here to kick things off. I mean, just in a couple of days and even the few months we've had to kind of wrap our head around this topic, you start to get a sense for how wicked the problem is, and obviously wish we had a little bit more time to dig in, but we'll share what we have and hopefully some thoughts that we can leave you with to maybe ponder, and even if we need to follow up after the fact, we're happy to do that. So the housing problem, from personal experience dealing with mental illness and substance abuse in my own family, and then I think about how important my own home is as it relates to me being really somewhat of an effective adult and husband and father and so on and so forth. My wife might debate that, but the point is, it's a big part of your independence, how you feel, if you're able to thrive in society. So we were happy to be able to grapple with this issue of housing and just try to figure out, put forth some recommendations that we thought might be helpful in terms of you advancing the agenda long term. From a problem overview standpoint, a lot of this is probably very familiar to people in the room, but and I'd be remiss if I didn't say thanks to Bill for the time that he spent with us, and John, and even Craig Dunson from Life Skills, and everybody else that we interacted with. But resources are a tough challenge, and Bill has to operate. He got called over the PA system multiple times, even yesterday. So it's more of a reactionary approach. Like, you have to figure out where to best spend your time and prioritize skips. So you really can't maybe take the most proactive approach in terms of trying to, anticipate where those challenges might be, and then, create a game plan, because you're always spending time trying to block and tackle and make sure that the day-to-day is taken care of. So we definitely acknowledge that piece. We looked at the data and the research that, both the broader research and the research that we did, or we looked at a review that was given to us. It says the complaints and grievances from a frequency standpoint, those are increasing, right? And I think on one hand, you look at that and say, hey, you always want to we're very, you've heard it, data-oriented folks, I'll say it again. But as those numbers increase, you want to make sure you understand kind of where are those coming from, and, do we have plans in place or, processes that we're considering to address those increases. And sometimes, the increases may not necessarily be a bad thing. So, as clients are more aware of their rights and, what's afforded to them, awareness can generate maybe a little bit of an increase in frequency, just because people, they're more comfortable with coming forward and stating, if there's an issue that may need to be tended to. I mentioned the proactive oversight. I mean, we get the resources are limited, and we tried to make sure we kept that in mind with our presentation or our recommendations. And then just one of the other challenges that became very apparent to us is just the communication with caseworker and the client and the ADAMHS Board and all the people that are involved around the placement. While the clients may be aware that they have options, some may understand that better than others. Caseworkers are very busy, lots to do. So really just trying to think about that process and how can we optimize around some of the experience within that process. Even within the RAP homes, a lot of those aren't up to the standards from, some of the information that Bill shared. Even the ones that you do have a little bit more control over, there's still opportunity to, bring some of those properties up to a better place. What role does the ADAMHS Board and the operators and all the other stakeholders have in that process? And then anytime, for us, we're always at Progressive, we're talking about operationalizing and efficiencies and how do we drive cost out by working, smarter, not harder, right? So we just kind of looked at some of the, processes and, from trying to maybe, automate things to the extent that you can, or use data to advance the agenda where we thought that might be appropriate. So I'll quickly go through the approach and I'll pass it off to Amy. So one of the things that we put at the top of the list and we kept very at the forefront was really just the human element, and just understanding that there are people and lives that are at stake in this process. So while you may go through and it's very easy to theoretically come up with recommendations and suggestions, you do have to understand, and I love the phrase that Craig from Life Skills uses, where theory meets practice. That's really the name of the game, right? I mean, there are a lot of things that theoretically make sense, but I think you really got to get into with some testing and piloting to really make sure that those are legitimate and viable options to move forward with. Took a systems view of the problem, so you'll see kind of how we approached it. I won't go into too much detail there. Stakeholder analysis was huge for us from an informative standpoint, just to really understand who are the players and where are the communication points and where can those be optimized. Really understanding where you have leverage was something we spent a lot of time talking about as a team, because even in my personal job, and I'm sure others can attest to, influencing without authority is a tough thing to do, right? When you don't actually have direct authority over someone's actions or what they might do, but you really need them to partner with you and do the things you need them to do, that's not always an easy thing to do, and just kind of being aware of that and kind of talking through how you might be more effective at that. We talk about barriers and outcomes, so what are the things that are getting in the way, and what outcomes would we like to see, and how do we kind of navigate through that terrain. We also brought in some process and technology recommendations. So I think just the world we live in, it's a reality, right? So technology's there. I'm on the fence in terms of how whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. It's not my personal. Not really time for my personal thoughts, but I do think there's some ways that we can bring in some, light lift technology solutions that might help, kind of advancing the agenda. And then really, how do you think about, short-term versus long-term implementation, right? So we tried to break our recommendations into hey, what more bite-sized, what can we do that may not cost a lot and requires many resources, and what's, we've developed some, prototypes and some mock-ups of some of the things that we're recommending. But then there's also a longer-term view, right, that from a strategic standpoint, we try to make sure we spend some time there and try to create a little bit of a balance between those two sets of recommendations. So with that, Amy, we'll get into the rest of the material. Yes.
And, am I on? I know myself, good. Well, thank you again for the opportunity to meet with you guys, learn from you, and to share some of the thoughts that we've had about the problems you guys are facing. So as we were going through thinking about this, we start brainstorming pretty instantly. And one thing we wanted to have was kind of a framework to hang some of our thoughts against, and also, as you guys carry forward, to think about, what are some good ways to attack this. So the awesome thing about the housing issue is really quickly it became apparent there's a virtuous cycle involved here. And that, if you're not familiar with the term, it's really something where it's part of a system. You're putting in good input. Every time you put that good input in, it comes back magnified as more goodness. So instead of being in a downward spiral, you're in an upward spiral. And that's what we're really talking about with the housing quality. It's how can you start raising the bar where you can, and how does that feed back into the system and ultimately come back to make it better and better? So the way we looked at this was, you put in your initial inputs of increasing your higher quality housing options. And we'll talk about this in a minute, but that's where do you guys have the influence and power to do that? So the inventory you have, what can you do to make more of that better? And then really the next thing is, once you have that available, how do you help your clients, your caseworkers know where that better quality housing is, right? So when we heard the stories of, you're thinking about it in the moment, somebody's trying to get placed. It feels like right now people just maybe send them somewhere that's top of mind, or maybe they're able to make a few calls, but it's not really easy to always know what's the best fit for this person and the best place to put them in their situation. So we want to be able to provide higher quality or better insight into those options. That should, we call it a market shift, but that should shift people, both their expectations of the quality of housing they should expect as a client, and also what your caseworkers are expecting as well on where they should be placing these people. And that really drives people to select these better quality options. So that gives those owner-operators, fuller homes, incents them to further keep their quality up so they can keep those customers. And the really awesome part of the cycle is the lower quality options are kind of pushed out of the market. So we follow this all the time in our own business models, but I think there's a real applicability here to what you guys are looking at. And so as you can see over time, you add these little increments, but then as the quality gets better, you're going to have more leverage to get it even better. And I think if you are seeing really good outcomes at your more local level and you have data around it, you can use that to influence even up to the state level to maybe, have them increase their quality standards from whatever baseline they have currently. So thinking about leverage points, right? So where are you going to kind of put in your effort in this cycle to get the most benefit out? So we really identified two main areas. One is with the wrap contract housing operators. So obviously, with those folks, for them to be contracted to work with you on that, they have to meet the criteria that you set. So you have really good options there to put those wherever you want, that bar for quality. So some of our, one set of our recommendations are going to fall under that kind of bucket, if you will. And then the next set is around data, no surprise, and communication. So having the data, but then being able to draw insights from the data and being able to share that with the right stakeholders to make good decisions based on that data. Oh, and I just wanted to point, the center, again, we're really just focused on the client, right? And I was just struck by, housing is important, obviously, but I think in situations most of us are in, we really take it for granted. And when you think about hierarchy of needs and people's ability to self-actualize and grow and become all they were meant to be as a human, that base is what? Food and shelter. And that's really what we're talking about here. So again, just wanted to keep that in mind as we go through this. Okay, so this is just kind of showing you how we bucketed up our recommendations in those two areas, whether it's how are we going to influence the wrap operators for the wrap housing, and then what are we going to do around the data and communication side. And we're going to go through that in more detail in the coming parts. But the other thing we wanted to share with you was how we kind of looked at, okay, the recommendations that we've come up with, what are the ones that make the most sense to do first, either low-hanging fruit or less cost to implement, or getting early learnings from whatever effort you're doing, versus the thing that will take longer, versus kind of the longer-term outcomes that you're looking for. So again, this is maybe more of a tool to look at later for how do you kind of go after these different things. So with that, I think we're going to get into the actual recommendations, and then go to Mary Lynn.
But first of all, again, thank you so much for hosting us. It has been so enjoyable for us to be able to take methodologies that we, leverage in our normal workday, but being able to apply them in such a different situation, and in a situation where, as Amy was just mentioning, we hopefully can be a springboard for you to enhance the influence that you have to really increase the quality and availability of excellent housing for your clients. And hopefully, if we can be effective in helping you do that, then Bill will have to exercise his authority a little bit less often, which would be really great. All right, so with that, we will get into more of our specific recommendations. As we mentioned in the intro, there are kind of two categories. We're going to start with the category where it's really focusing on those home operators that have wrap contracts. And certainly some of the recommendations we'll provide, we think could be applicable to that. So those wrap operators are 100-ish. There's 200 to 300 more that don't fall into that category. Hopefully a couple of the ideas we came with, if we start them in the wrap group of homes, then they may, hopefully that could spread to the other ones as well. But as it was mentioned, we thought let's leverage first and pilot first where you have the most influence and have those funds directly going and have more control. So we're going to start actually with suggestions and ideas around the contract that you have with the wrap operators. A template of the one that is kind of the working copy right now. I know you're in the process of making changes to it. So we took a look at that, and then we made a few suggestions of potential items and kind of categories of items. So maybe these aren't the exact right ones, but just things to think about as you continue to evolve your selection process and then inevitably the contracts and the agreements that you make with these providers. So our goal in suggesting these contract changes would be, one, to really make sure that the bottom line is to increase the safety in the homes, for sure. So that's number one. So that's where some of our suggestions come from, as far as what are those things that are absolutely most important, critical to make sure that you have safe environments for all of the clients to live in. And that's where some of the things came from, suggestions came from, such as pest control and proof that that is being managed effectively and consistently. Cameras, potentially in common areas or maybe outside. So utilizing existing technology, maybe like a Ring doorbell type or something where you wouldn't be, you could take an end product and make an installation in some of the homes. We're also talking about the staffing requirements within the homes. We mentioned, or we referenced in the contracts, that there weren't necessarily specific staffing requirements, so is that something to consider, or something to consider depending on the size or the type of the home, is if there are specific ratios for staff to home dwellers. We heard a lot from Bill and from Craig yesterday and from John around the home inspections and kind of getting those eyes on the home. And so that's an important part of finding out about problems early and being able to address them, hopefully before they become extremely serious to the point where you would have to remove people from the home. So we wanted to be creative around what might we do to make it more efficient and possible to more often get those eyes on the home. So that's where we had several suggestions here around technology. So a requirement that the home would have Wi-Fi, a requirement that the home would have the ability perhaps to have some kind of a, and it could just be the mobile phone of the home operator to communicate with folks from the board or your designees as far as doing just a walkthrough from the house, you know, receiving a call once a month or once every other month, just walking around the house, not only to check in with the operator, how's it going, do you have concerns, but then also, you know, are the smoke detectors working? What's the condition of the refrigerator? Checking on some basic things, certainly more basic than when Bill or any of your other employees would go out for a visit, but at least it's a little more often keeping that touch point. All right, and I think we're ready to move on to our billing, and then we're going to come back.
Hello, everyone. Again, you've heard several people from our group today talk about data and how important that is to Progressive, and we're big believers in what you measure, you improve upon. And one thing that was pretty striking to us was several people have mentioned kind of some lack of controls. Like, we don't always know how the overall system is working. So a lot of our discussions were around how can we get ADAMHS more information to be able to be more proactive on things rather than always be having to react in a given situation. So part of the process that we focused on was around the billing process. We thought, this is something that happens today. Could we tweak a few things as part of this process that will allow ADAMHS to get information from the operators? So we thought there was value just by itself in making the billing process consistent. But then we also said, well, what if we took it a step further? There were some issues where sometimes a client may have moved from one house to another and ADAMHS wasn't aware of it. So we went down a path of it. At Progressive, each of us have our own employee ID. Each of us have a location ID. Did we want to institute something like that to say, is there a client ID, a unique identifier to that person? Is there a location ID to a unique identifier to a house or a bed that we could start to match some of these things up and ensure that we're billing the right people at the right time? At the same time, could we get some additional information from operators that we feel would help us move things forward rather than having to react? So what if we had them supply, how many total beds do they have in the house and how many are occupied right now? You know, we've heard the caseworkers, a lot of the agencies have to call around to find a bed. Could we make that easier for them in some manner? What if they asked us to look at how many, Mary Lynn had mentioned monthly pest control receipts. Are there things like that that we would want them to send in, photo evidence of fire alarms or lock boxes for the medicine or things like that, that rather than having to send a person to a house to view those things, could we include that as part of the billing process where they would have to send that in to us? Also, we heard that there were feedback from operators that they didn't always have a voice, that if there were issues in the house, they didn't have a place to go to. Could you make that part of the invoice as well too? Even just a small section to say they'd like to talk to someone, they're having issues or something like that. So we weren't suggesting to do all of these things, but we said start small, and there's a whole spectrum of things you could do around billing, all the way to the most advanced, which is an online portal, but that also comes with expense and maintenance and a bunch of things that ADAMHS may not be able to do right now. But you can start with 1 house or 5 houses and start some of this billing process and see, are you getting the information that's valuable to you? Are the operators able to fill it out? Are you able to get that feedback loop that you want? So we thought that this was something you could start small and build off of, but that would start feeding you the information that you're looking for and make the billing process more consistent as a whole as well. So in the appendix, we included a mock-up of what an invoice might look like, and then we also included what like a monthly roll-up might look like of some of these measures, that if you wanted to see month by month, how much money did we expect to be going out, how much money did actually go out, what's the variance, why is that? So we have a mock-up of what that looks like as well too, to see if that's something that would be helpful. You can say.
I was just going to say that reminds me of what was mentioned actually in the last presentation, and we talked about a number of times through our idea generating, is the use of interns or even maybe local high school students. Understand you have to consider the privacy of data and that type of thing, but the idea of developing the invoice or bringing people in for data entry, because as you said, ideally it would just be a lovely, you go on the internet and they just put it in and it magically populates to you, and we realize that's a little longer term to implement. You still might, but we still see a lot of value in starting soon with just, even if they're still mailing those hard copies into you, say, here's what I need you to fill out and send in, and so you're getting 100 or so invoices every month coming in. You know, those invoices would have to be entered, but at least you would have a consistent format to follow and be able to start getting the baseline to leverage your data. Okay. All right. So we're going to finish up this section with some incentives, and this is when Amy talked about that virtuous cycle. At the beginning, part of what she mentioned, and kind of a really key part of our thought process, was how do we bring up the quality of the entire housing program, all of the houses. And so to do that, we're going to start focusing on the 100 or so that are in the contracted system. But then beyond that, how do we take the ideas generated there and move on? So how do we make basically those 100, what sets them apart, and how do we make the rest of the operators want to be part of that 100? So these were ideas that we generated along those lines. Basically, we understand these are businesses. I mean, most of these operators have gone into it with the right intention and the right heart for wanting to help these people, but no matter if they're just considering it to be their business or they're in it because they truly understand the need and want to help the folks at a personal level, no matter what, it has to be an effective business model. They have to be able to sustain themselves. And them, you know, receiving and using the money appropriately only makes the system better. So how do we make it financially advantageous for our operators to want to be part of the ADAMHS network? So we thought of things that would both be incentives for them and also improve the quality of the home environment. So one category was negotiated purchase discount. So we have some examples here, and I think we even have a longer list we can share with you of if the ADAMHS board, and I realize this is probably inserting you in a role that you haven't traditionally been in, so it's maybe a longer-term strategic option, but actually similar to what the first group was talking about with centralizing some services and finding effectiveness from that. The same thing could be true here. This in particular may take a little bit of upfront work, but then be relatively self-sustaining, is to make some negotiations with the kinds of services that all of your homeowners either do already use or would be really great if they did use, such as the pest control, maybe wholesale club memberships to help them with buying groceries, financial services. Do they need help doing taxes? Do they need help learning to make a budget? And how do they even track their data to make them more effective business owners? The education and onboarding I'll address next. So best practices there. We saw some examples of really great homes. So how do we get the word out? Can we encourage those people that are doing it really well to share how they're doing it? And it could be, you know, mentoring one-on-one. That might take a little bit more or longer to implement. But are there shorter term things where you're just really compiling some documentation that would, again, take a little bit of upfront work, could be just on paper, hard copy at first, and then eventually accessed online, where you're allowing people to generate ideas about, oh, okay, it could even be almost, you know, so there's a Bible, and then maybe you've seen like the Bible, you can get different versions. I call it like the Bible companion. It's like, here's the Bible, here's what it says. So if you think of that as your regs, the big, we started looking at some of them, very long list of regs that these houses have to comply to. So if that's the Bible, what's the Bible companion? So how do we create that companion that helps them understand what does that actually look like in my home? What would I actually do to be compliant with that? So it is, again, could be some upfront work, but you've got a lot of people that are doing it well that could probably help with that compilation. And that's one of those ideas where it could be great, or it could be effectively maybe started and shared with your contracted homes, but then hopefully that's something that could be leveraged to all of the homes, all the 350 that are part of the licensed homes. All right, and finally in this section was supporting homes in achieving their maximum occupancy. This comes back to these are small business owners, and so obviously if they have a home, it is most financially advantageous to have that home operating and most efficient at maximum occupancy. And we heard about examples where there are really wonderful homes out there and they're not filled. And it really breaks your heart to know that there are people living in sometimes scary conditions when there are other options available. So we thought, how is it that we can help to shift some of that into those homes that have openings? So our suggestion here was to find a way to start almost advertising or promoting those homes that have basically excellent facilities, and you know that they do. And in our next section, we're going to talk about some tracking and some mechanisms on that point. But then how do you get the word out that they actually have beds available? Because those caseworkers, from what we understand, they're calling around, do you have what's available? If we could be a little more proactive in saying, hey, this is what's available, you know, come look here, that would save them some time, hopefully, as well as start directing to where they're going to get the best care. And that actually ties back to, again, long-term, it could be fancy portal-driven, but short-term, that was actually the impetus for us including in our billing suggestions. We asked not only billing information about the patients, or the clients that are there now, but we asked to include how many beds are in the house, how many beds are occupied, how many beds do you have available. So at least once a month, you're getting a data point of this is how many beds are available in the homes within our network, And then you can match that up with some of the data that we'll talk about next as far as, okay, I know they have beds available and I know they're an excellent home. So let's get that word out. All right, so we'll turn it over to the data team next.
Thank you so much. I'm Amy Swartz, and I promise I will be the last one to talk to you about data today. So we'll try to make this a little bit more real. It's actually in the Progressive DNA, but we think it can be really, really helpful here. So we have a strategy, kind of the second component of our strategy that Amy talked about was using data to provide proactive visibility into the housing. Because one of the things we heard very loud and clear is that you don't get out to the homes frequently enough to see problems until they've turned into pretty significant problems and points where the clients have been living in those situations for some time. So our goal was to think about how do we get insight into that house without always having to have eyes or physical people in the house doing an inspection. So I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the ideas we had to leverage other data points to give some of that same insight. Along with that, we think there's some collective strategies here where not only can we be gathering data to gain insight, but we can also, through that, develop greater communication throughout the whole ecosystem of clients, partner agencies, caseworkers, and the ADAMHS Board. So from an initial standpoint, our first recommendation would be let's build a framework for data acquisition. So we've all talked about data, but the hard reality is you've got to have a way to start collecting it. So we thought there might be some interesting ways to easily start collecting that data and build some of that two-way communication. And one of those is to simply proactively ask for feedback. You heard that earlier when we talked about asking for feedback through the billing mechanism for operators. We think there's other low-tech solutions that could allow you to get really immediate feedback. So one of the things, and we'll show you a couple of examples in a minute, is just doing a quick reach out to your clients via text message. So as we understand it, a good number of the clients have mobile phones. A good number of the caseworkers are working on tablets or on mobile phones. And even some of the peer support group folks we understood had mobile phones as well. So what a great way, we all connect that way today, could we use to connect with clients. And the nice thing about text messaging is not only can it get you some communication, but it also starts to build you a valuable data set. And we'll show you that in a minute. And then secondly, at the same time, we would initiate work toward building a dashboard. So as we think about those operators and those 100 or so wrap homes that we really want to ensure get occupied because they could represent the best of the best, we'd love to start thinking about other ways to collect data. So as we're building this mechanism to communicate and to gather data, we'd start thinking about who are all the stakeholders that could be contributing data, who would be consuming that data, and then actually hold a summit with those folks to say what are other ways besides eyes in the house that we can understand how the operations are working. And we also engage and recommend that you engage, and I think we've heard lots of good ideas about how to reach out into the community to pull in things like analytical expertise to assist with defining what those metrics might be. So is it how often are beds occupied or other metrics that could drive some insight? But let us share just a quick example. So these are just some quick mock-ups that we threw up. Again, very low tech, could happen pretty quickly, could gather data and build communication. So we really see text messaging as an easy and accessible way to create two-way communication, strengthen relationships, and gather data. So here's a couple of quick examples. So client is in the home for the first time. You could reach out through text message to say, hope you're settling in. Respond anytime if you have an issue. So you're actually creating a way for clients to escalate issues in a very easy fashion with something that they might have in their pocket. Or would you proactively reach out regularly throughout their stay to say, hey, we're just touching base, and ask one question, are you feeling safe today? Yes or no? You're building communication, but you're also collecting data that we could leverage on the back end. Or just checking in to see if you're comfortable. At Progressive, we use a single question to measure customer satisfaction, and that's, would you refer Progressive to a friend or family member? And we also had a lot of discussion about, would that be a question that might be applicable here, whether it's for family members or clients themselves, or even your caseworkers to say, would you refer someone to live in this property, yes or no? And that alone could drive a metric that might be key in helping assess the quality of the living facility. We threw a couple of providers on here, so this might feel really onerous to think about how do we stand up some sort of text messaging campaign. The reality is there are a host of providers, fairly low cost. We've used a few of these at Progressive. Twilio, Zipwhip, Message Media, they're really turnkey solutions where they give you all the tools you need using Excel spreadsheets and other pretty simple tools to initiate a campaign. So just one example, but this would really be the first piece to our data strategy, as well as building some two-way communication. The second piece would be to start to develop and utilize that data. So we're starting to gather some data through that two-way communication, perhaps through text. We've started to think about what are those key performance indicators that we want. We'd really kind of want to then figure out how do we make that consumable for people. And that would start with identifying the requirements for an analytical platform or system, maybe engaging some resources to figure out what are the best systems to do that. It could be as simple as an Excel spreadsheet. We've got some examples in the appendix for you of how you might set up a very simple set of key performance indicators to measure your housing units on. In a very, very simple and straightforward way. And then we'd say build the system and build processes perhaps to establish new channels of data. So we understand that it might be hard to have access to all the data you need. So we even talked about things, would there be processes that we should build, like deputizing a force of volunteers to regularly visit some of these homes and gather feedback? And is that a new process that would give us some additional insight that we did not have in the past? And then we'd say, thirdly, we would start to use the data that we build to optimize outcomes. And so we start to think about, earlier you heard this term portal. We start to think about how do we take all that data, all that communication that we're getting, and then some of the other suggestions you heard around providing support to the operators through a portal. So we think about this as really the long-term end state, probably something that you build towards. And in that portal, you might have the ability for not only clients and caseworkers and the ADAMHS Board and peer support groups to both contribute and consume data. And they could be functions like this. If we've got good enough key performance indicators on a home, both through in-home inspections, feedback from clients, feedback from caseworkers, and KPIs, do we now have a sense of kind of what properties are the best? If we have an understanding of what clients' needs are, could we perform capability to allow us to match those clients? So think about the match.com between your clients and the homes that they might want to live in. So you could literally tier up what are the needs of this client, what homes do we have available, and then based on the key performance indicators that you've collected on those homes and the data you have, say, oh, this home has available beds, it meets the needs of the clients, and it's the best performing in terms of all of the indicators that we've suggested. So it performs a really nice match that requires input from all those folks in that ecosystem, but the portal could allow them to easily engage with that. It could also allow for notification of preferred homes. So if you're connecting folks through text messaging, perhaps we allow that portal to push out proactive messages to caseworkers saying, hey, here's a home in our tier 1 segment of homes that just become available. Think about things like rent.com, or when you're looking to buy a home, that are pushing you notifications of properties you might want to look at. We could enable some very similar functionality here. And then you heard earlier Mary Lynn talk about the support for operators. We think about building within this a marketplace where those operators could go to access those discounts, to find out about those discounts, to match with other businesses that might provide support, and also might even allow them a way to build a profile of their home. So giving them web space to really advertise and promote what's good about the home and the operation that they have in place. So really a 3-tiered approach to using data to drive communication, pull information, and then make that information usable and functions through this portal. And I'm going to lastly hand it off to Azadeh to talk about our approach to change management.
Thank you. Great. Is everybody exhausted? A lot of information in the last 2 hours, so hopefully you can bear with me. So one of the things that we talked about, whether it's changes that you want to make related to housing quality, changes you want to make in terms of promoting a better workforce or attracting more talent, there's always some level of change management, right? And how are you actually going to implement this? So there are a lot of models for change management out there, so we thought we would share with you one that's leveraged widely across Progressive. We get a lot of training in it. So we thought that it would be just maybe valuable just to make people aware of this model and framework, no matter what it is that you decide to do. So this is the ADCAR model, and the acronym ADCAR. The first one is around awareness. So who are your stakeholders, and is there an awareness for even a need to change? Because obviously, if your stakeholders are not bought into making any type of change, it's going to be really difficult to do anything, right? The next one is the desire to support and participate in the change. So now you've got awareness around the problem, and is there actually desire to make a change? Because again, what we're talking about here, the wicked problems, it's hard. They're out there for a reason, right? Because there are so many different steps in the funnel. There's so many different influences in terms of why things happen. Even when people go in with the best of intents, sometimes there's just other outside forces that make it more difficult. But if people have the desire, then you can potentially overcome when some of those obstacles come up. Then there's the knowledge of how to change, right? So oftentimes we say it in our own lives or with our kids, like, okay, I know something needs to happen, I have the desire to happen, but I don't know how to make it happen. So how do we make that happen? What are the skills and tools that we need to make that change? And do we have the ability to do that? Do we need training? Do we need awareness? Do we need additional tools that will give us and empower us towards that change? And then how do you reinforce that? Because change takes time, and it's very easy for us to kind of go back into what's easiest, right? Like into whatever habits we already have. So in order to reinforce that, you need champions. You also need to see benefit, right? That you need to actually see something having some type of success. So how do you get those little wins that you can build upon to get bigger wins? So that's what the model is. I'm sure that a lot of you have leveraged pieces and parts of this in your own life. You just maybe didn't put an acronym to it, but it is actually a really useful tool to think about a lot of different things. And so we're trying not to be too presumptive, but we did put together a sample so that hopefully that just gives you some context to how we were thinking about this. So I'll just, because I think we have a little bit of time, so I'll quickly just run through a couple of these things. So we talked about the awareness for the needs to change, right? So who are the stakeholders when it comes to quality housing? So obviously ADAMHS has a stake in this because you're funding clients to go and live in these houses. You have the responsibility for taking those grievances and investigating them, and an overall sense of wanting all of, obviously the desire to making sure that everybody who you're serving is getting the quality housing and care that they need, so you have that stake in it. The operators have a stake in this, right? Because operators, they either want their housing to be fully staffed, they also want to make sure they have good clients that, is easy for them, and I think ultimately we did talk about some people do view this as a business, and so they want to have a successful business. We know that a lot of people go into it with the right heart, but there's also that business element to it. Then you have the caseworkers and agencies who are interacting on a daily basis with these clients, trying to do their best, but also have a lot going on, right? And so they're just trying to do their best, making sure that they can do right by their client, but sometimes time and efficiency for their particular day, like efficiency in the moment, but maybe not like efficiency overall is like what's driving the behavior of that in that moment. And then the clients themselves. So if we understand that like a quarter of based on the statistics, it kind of varied, but it seemed like at least a quarter of the houses that are contracted through the RAP program were not up to quality standards based on feedback that we had gotten from people that we talked to. So making people aware of that, like do people even know that? From what we understand, the process of manually having to call around and find that placement can make it and incentivize like maybe not the best behaviors, because you just got to get through that day and find something quickly for the client that you're getting to. And then the inability to have that proactive communication right now, just perhaps because we don't have the right tools in place and things like that, might make it hard for identifying problems prior to the grievances being filed. So that's just one example of like okay, do we have the awareness of what some of the problems really are there? And then, is there the desire? And what are the benefits to each of those stakeholders to make that change, right? Whether it's greater awareness, more efficiency, making the caseworkers' lives easier to help them match clients and do less manual work. Whether for the operators it's about filling their homes, getting more support and guidance, because that came up as something that they would be really interested in getting. So those are the types of things that, if you start to break it down, then you can start to look at, hey, change is actually possible. And then maybe you don't even have to go at it all 100 RAP operators. You start with 5 or 10 that will be easier to work with, and you start to try to figure out, can we work together to try to solve this problem together, test out a few things that we've been thinking about, see if we see benefits for you, for the client, for the caseworkers, and for us, and then take those learnings, evolve that process, and then hopefully find some benefits that you can then turn into bigger benefits and take that, like what you've done with that small group, and make it broader and then broader and broader. So we talked about that before. So that helps with that reinforcement. You don't have to tackle it all at once. Take 5 or 10 homes, and then start with some of the things that seem to make sense for you all, and go from there. So that's the model that we just wanted to put out there to help, with the jump starting of whatever it is that you decide to do, whether it's any of these ideas or, we know you have tons of ideas that are already in the hopper. So hopefully this would be helpful. There's also in this deck some appendix slides that people referenced before that have tools that we were hoping that could be helpful to just get a jump start to see, oh, actually some of these things might not be as difficult to, get started on a small scale. So hopefully those are useful. So any questions? I think that was it, right, Barb?
Yeah.
So if you have any questions, we'll be happy to take them.
Yeah, question on the contacting people by text. Would we respond back to these texts? So let's say the one that says, are you feeling safe at home? Yes or no? What would be the next step in that?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. The question was, would the ADAMHS Board need to respond to the text, particularly if somebody said, no, I'm not feeling safe? I think those are processes you certainly need to work through. And what I'd recommend is, one, you kind of have a way now to say that there's a grievance, you can tag it to a client. I think you would want to develop some sort of response, and whether that's reaching out by phone to talk to them, or whether it's having somebody visit them in person, I think you'd have to determine. It might even be a response to say, would you like help? And if so, then it's a reach out by phone. What I would not expect is for that whole communication necessarily to be by text. We've learned in our business environment, even dealing with customers, and I would imagine it's the same as a client. Text is great for certain things, knowing if something's happened, knowing if somebody needs help. It's not always the best way to resolve the circumstances. So there might be some other sort of reach out that you want to pair that with.
So Progressive, you follow up to text sometimes?
We do. So I'm from the claims department. We utilize text quite frequently, and it's interesting. It's been very good for certain interactions. So it's good to say, hey, we're trying to get in touch with you. Like, we're trying to call you. Pick up the phone when we call you. Or we need some immediate feedback. Or we've scheduled an appointment for you, and here's where you need to be and when. It's not really good for communicating decisions. So for instance, we're not going to pay your claim today. Those are communications, and something tough, particularly with a client, that's more for a phone call or an in-person conversation. But for quick hit, and I always liken it to my own personal experience, I'm telling my daughter where to meet me or something she needs to do. That's fantastic. Giving her the rationale of why she needs to do it, probably not best served in a text message. But yeah, I think it's a great thing to think about. There's got to be a response protocol around that as well.
Seems like it would be a great potential avenue or a partnership with you already have the peer partnership with Life Skills, and where they're the client advocate. So when you're thinking about what process that you might use when a client actually does say they're having trouble, it seems like they would be, for example, a great first line of talking to them, because that's their goal, right, is to advocate on behalf of the client.
Along the lines of kind of piloting and starting small scale, you might send that text to 5 people the first time and see how it goes.
Right.
Until you work out the process.
5,000.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, Yeah, it's interesting, a lot of the solutions, that's a great point that we've tested. In the early days of testing text with our customers, we did start very small with very manual, one by one, typing out tests through a tool, seeing how it went. And it was a great way to realize that, oh wow, a quarter of the people do respond. And so we need to think about how we're going to respond. Or they want to attach pictures, which may be a good thing or not a good thing. So you need to anticipate, what they might attach to those text messages as well.
Or you can even use it maybe as a follow-up or in conjunction with some other fact-finding. So maybe some of the other information that's coming in, you're beginning to get a little bit suspicious about maybe a particular operator or residence. So you could send that message to just all of the residents within that particular home to see if you're getting any consistency in the way they're responding to you.
I think that the other reason why text was appealing to us is, when we were mapping out what the customer journey really looks like from, so your wrap clients are mostly individuals who are coming out of the hospital or jail, right? And so their first touch is the caseworker is helping them try to figure out, okay, where should we go? What kind of treatment do you need? Where are you going to stay? Then from our understanding, it's the caseworker that determines, like, hey, they might be a candidate for funding from ADAMHS, right, to pay for their stay. And so they know who ADAMHS is, but they're not actually talking to you, right? So as they finally go through their journey of eventually getting placed somewhere, even that first welcome text is a reminder that, hey, we're here for you. You have this connection for us because we're paying for your stay there, but you haven't actually met us yet. Maybe it's an easier first touch point, just to remind them that, hey, we're here, and it's, start to build that relationship, because we did talk a lot about how the grievances don't necessarily come from the clients, because they don't necessarily have that relationship with you, but it's the family members or those other things. Even though they know you're paying for them, are there little ways like this that you can start to create that relationship if you want to be able to have some of that information sooner? That would be valuable to do that. We might be getting that wrong, but at least that's what we heard when we talked through the journey process of, you're playing a role for them, a pretty significant role for them, but they know you on paper. They know your name, but they don't necessarily know you, right? They don't, so.
Hi. I'm not sure, are you all familiar with the RSS program?
Yeah.
It's a state program. It's basically exactly like the RAP program. I was wondering, what should we do? Because the RSS program has numbers that they use. They use $1,100 for the rent amount for a group home, just like we do. I was wondering if you could suggest what our numbers should be if RSS is charging $1,100 and then they also give $200 to the client for spending money each month. What should be the ADAMHS Board's RAP program's numbers? Should we be higher rent than them, or should we be lower rent than them, or should we do the personal spending allowance of $200? Should we do that? Should we be more or less than that? Any ideas on that?
So, we did talk about it. Oh, no, you go.
I think one of the things that we talked about a little bit is around what kind of flexibility you have in determining what that number is. Because I think one of the things that we believe in as a company, and I think is very valuable in a lot of different applications, is segmentation, right? So when the data precedes, like once you know more about these operators, and let's use the 94 or 100 to start with, similar to the other program they talked about, the other group they talked about tiering, right? So you can come up with different tiers, so it may not be the same amount for everybody, right? Some operators may be able to earn their way up into a different place if they meet certain criteria. And I think when you structure a program like that, you start to build some franchise value where people start to seek out, okay, well, how can I get more, right? Like, what do I need to do to get access to these other bells and whistles? So I think you just got to, first of all, see, like, within the budget, what do we have to spend? Because I think that's probably the starting point. Like, you don't have what you don't have. But I do think you can introduce some pretty simple segmentation to say, hey, we have more valuable operators to our network because they do the things we're asking them to do. they keep our costs low. We don't have to send the bill out many times to, check on things. So I think, kind of thinking about it from a tiering standpoint, like, all right, on average, here's what we have to spend, but that doesn't mean everybody that's an operator within the RAP program will get the same amount.
I do think in addition, the optimization of some of the discounts that Mary Lynn talked about, so the ability to have access to services and discounted providers, while it's not coming through in that rent payment, it is a monetary incentive for them. So that's another way to think about it. I'm getting $1,100 in rent, but I'm also getting access to services because I'm part of that tier 1 provider group that you talked to.
We actually even talked about, we didn't know if it was feasible, but, so for example, if you have a home that has 5 people in it, instead of paying $1,100 a month to that home, would you pay, $5 less and for each person and automatically send the pest control every month? So that you take that extra step of having to coordinate all those things out of their hands, but then you make sure that you're getting that quality in the house related to something that seems to be a consistent problem. So, and because you're doing it for multiple homes, maybe you get a better rate. So instead of like a typical rate of $35 per month for the pest control, you're able to bring it down to 30 or 25. So you're able to get some level of quality in there and take like an extra step out of the hands of the operator that might already have a lot of things on their plate. But that's where you'll have to do that, like get with the 5 to 10 operators who you think would be up for kind of working through some of these details with you and figuring out like what could work. Let's try a few things out and say, oh, this is actually really great. I'm really appreciating this, or like we've arranged grocery delivery, weekly, but that means you're getting a little bit less, for the rent. But ultimately, it's still more for them. If you make the business case for like the ultimate budget is still, works out in their favor because they still have to provide that stuff anyway. So if you can get better pricing or just do those things to ensure it, but it does mean more onus on the ADAMHS board, right? But as that centralized resource, it goes back to the same like centralizing some of the work. Sorry.
No, I was trying to get the mic by you so I could hear you. The only thing I would add to that is, the first thing I thought of when you said that is, first of all, I have no idea what the right answer is. But then after that, I thought, whatever you decide to pursue or ideas you have, I would consider the whole kind of life cycle of that client's experience. Because from if I understood correctly, RAP is a short-term, or meant to be a short-term solution where then they would move on to RSS program. And ideally, you'd probably like to disrupt the home situation as least as possible. So you want to make sure whatever you do, you don't want to necessarily incent operators to, once people are off, they're not RAP, I don't want them in my home, I want to make room for more RAP. You want to make sure you're keeping the experience of the client as best it can be.
Last thing I'd ask, one thing that we touched on a little is at some point it might make sense to consider bridging the two wicked problems that we talked about, right? So if you've got, if you have a client centricity view, it's all about empowering and making sure the client's living the best life they can live. You potentially may have some clients that actually may funnel into the talent acquisition strategy for caseworkers or other things, because those people that have been there, and similar to Craig Dunson's story, he's more passionate about it because he's lived it, right? And I think, when you talk about retention of employees and people that might be passionate about the work, at some point trying to figure out, okay, how can we empower these people to get on their own 2 feet and live a productive life, and then maybe funnel them into a different function within the organization or the ecosystem. Something to consider in terms of trying to connect the dots between the 2 models. So, any other questions? We got time.
That's the sign.
Sounds like
Next time, bring some IT people and technology.
You want to wrap up? All right, thank you guys.
I just wanted to say thank you very much to Progressive. Thank you very much to BVU for bringing them to us. Thank you very much to our staff for providing the, what do you call them? Subject matter. SMEs, right, subject matter experts. And I just want to say how I am so impressed with everybody from Progressive that you were just here for a day and you could offer these suggestions to us, and you could talk our language too, rap, RSS, things like that. So I just want to say this was, I hope with our staff too, right, if you could show, right, this was an outstanding opportunity for us, I think. So I just wanted to thank you all for taking your time and lending your expertise to us. So just thank you very much.